there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in research about Paul. So I've been interested in that for the past year, and believe it or not, in my 26 years here in teaching classes, I've never taught a class just on Paul. So, and my ideas about who he is have changed, and you'll see this in today's class. So, before we get started, I didn't know, did you guys see the Apostle Paul on Jeopardy? So this was the final Jeopardy question, or that's the answer. You had to fill in the answer. Paul's letter to them is the New Testament epistle with the most Old Testament quotations. And why is this important? Because they got it wrong. They did. They got it wrong, and they refused to budge, and the wrong person won. If you look, they had 20-some thousand. The winner ends up getting $26,000 out of being wrong on this. So does anybody know the answer to this? You're not a dummy if you don't.
Hebrews?
So that's the answer that they gave,
Right.
but Paul didn't write Hebrews. We don't know who wrote Hebrews. And so all of these theologians decided that they would learn about Twitter. And if you type in Hebrews and Paul and Jeopardy, you'll find all of these people, I can't believe. And they responded by saying, we know a theologian, and we asked this about it. But the thing is, Hebrews is in the Bible because people in the early church thought that it was written by Paul. The real answer and the right answer is Romans. And the other person answered Romans. And they said, you're wrong. And that person didn't get any money as a result. And the winner ended up going on to win $80,000. So she would have been bounced at this point. So before we get started, I want to hear from you guys on something. And that is, what do you guys know about the life of Paul? I was going to use the sketch thing and write it out. But help me out a little bit and just tell me any details you know about him or what he taught. We'll take like 5 or 6 of what they are. So what are some of the things that...
He was a persecutor of the early church.
Right, okay.
Legal training.
What's that?
Legal training.
Legal training. Yeah, so he was, what did he say that he considered himself?
What was his comment?
I didn't hear, what was yours?
Oh, legal training is.
Yours was legal training, right?
No, the guy behind.
Oh, that was yours, what was yours?
He was just asking what he said.
Oh, okay. He said legal training. Anyway, let's go ahead.
Saul of Tarsus.
Saul, okay. Any ideas why he's Saul and Paul?
Well, you go from the Hebrew to the Greek with the name.
Okay. Go ahead.
He landed on Malta and was bitten by a snake.
Okay.
Continued on the road to Damascus.
On the road to Damascus, right? Go ahead.
Pharisee of Pharisees.
When was he a Pharisee of Pharisees?
Didn't he describe himself as that, or?
Early or late in his ministry?
Very early. Very early.
Okay, you said Damascus. Let's stop there for just a second. So when he was on his way to Damascus and he's struck down by Jesus, was he on a horse or not?
No.
We always think so.
I thought
Okay.
so too.
So it's funny when you look at Renaissance art.
That's why.
This is Caravaggio.
Wow.
This is Michelangelo. He's on his horse. His horse is running away. He wants nothing to do with this extra vision thing that's going on. Another painting where everybody has a horse. But the answer is there's no. Paul tells the story 3 different times. Not always the same story in the book of Acts about his conversion experience. And we're going to talk late in one of the later classes about what do we do when there's stuff in Acts that doesn't match what Paul wrote, and how do you deal with those things. But he told the story 3 different times, and there's no horse in any of those 3. So, and the funny thing is, there was a research paper a couple of years ago saying if you're Catholic, you believe he was on a horse, and if you're Protestant, you don't believe he was on a horse. So you guys are Protestants, so he's not on a horse. So I'm going to start actually at the end. I'm going to tell you some of the things that we're going to know about Paul when we're done with this class. And Who was he? Who was he? And some of these things might be a little bit different than what you understand, but we're going to eventually get back to this stuff, okay? Paul considered himself a Pharisaic Jewish person, as you said, from birth to death. In his last letter, he refers to himself as a Pharisee. So, bringing up the topic that we did about the conversion, what does that mean about the conversion? If he's a Pharisaic Jewish person until he died, so what was he converted from and to? Just think about that, okay? Because we're gonna look at this question of conversion, because the typical story we say is he started off a Jew and he converts to Christianity, but there is no Christianity when he converts around AD 35, okay? So he thought he was a Jew, and he thought his whole life that he was Jewish. Another interesting thing that we have, he wrote no letters. We have no letters to any Jewish community. So we don't know how Paul talked to Jewish people compared to how he talks to Gentiles. So when he talks to Gentiles, sometimes he's really, really nice, like in Romans about Jewish people, and other times he's not very nice to them. As he says, he adapted his message to whoever he's talking to. And the interesting thing for us is, and the guy who organizes these trips for me, he asked every time, and he just asked, sent me an email asking, how many supersessionists are going to be in the group that you're taking? And I tell him the same thing that I always do. Most educated Jewish people know what supersession is. Most educated Protestant people have no idea what we're talking about. The question is basically, did Paul believe there were two lanes? That you could get to salvation through the law and remain a Jew without believing in Jesus, and that there was a lane for Gentiles to accept Jesus? Or did he believe that Jews had to accept Jesus or not? This is a huge controversy within academia, whether he was one or, and so the question is basically, is there one covenant or two? Okay? And the Catholic Church in the last 50 years has changed its position on this. And the theology in response to the Holocaust has changed as a result. So, other things. Paul thought Jesus would return in his lifetime. So his first letters to Thessalonians. So first of all, remember, these are letters that Paul never intended for us to be reading 2,000 years later. He thought he was dealing with situations at that time, and he was trying to fix situations. And what's happening in Thessalonica is he told them, Jesus is coming back soon, and be prepared. Focus on that. That's what you should be doing. He leaves. A couple of years pass. People die in the congregation, and they write him and say, what's going on? Jesus hasn't returned. And so his letter is answering that question. He's saying he still will return. We just need to adjust our calendars a little bit. And this issue changes over time. He eventually, in Romans, is like, okay, maybe it's not going to be exactly like I thought it was going to be. Paul urged followers of Jesus to ignore quotidian concerns. And this is important. When we're looking at some of the things, radical things he says, you have to realize he thought Jesus was coming and the kingdom of God was coming any minute. So he was saying, don't focus on the things of this world. Don't focus on those things. Like, should you start a business? He says no, because Jesus is coming back. You shouldn't do that. And one of his most controversial things he said is, don't get married. He says, if you're going to burn with passion and end up doing something, inappropriate, then you could get, but for the most part, don't get married. It's not because he liked or disliked the institution of marriage. It's because he thought the end of life was, the end times were coming, and Jesus was returning. So his point was, ignore doing that sort of stuff. You don't want to be caught up in a new relationship and everything. It's funny, later on, Paul is used as someone who supports for celibacy for everybody, and it's using this text here. This is an interesting thing that changed the way I was thinking about who Paul is, and we'll get back to this later on. Paul thought Jesus would return only when Gentiles converted, and he believed that he was appointed by God to do this job. And so in the Old Testament, it's not just about Jews. There are passages from the time of Abraham to Isaiah that says not just not just the Jews will be saved, but the nations will too. And the nation stands for all Gentiles. And he knew that there were Jews accepting Jesus and that they were following the law. And he thought he was called to go to Gentiles and convert them. And when he did that, then Jesus would return. Because God promised that the nations would be saved and that God was going to be true to his promises. And he felt like it was his job. So when you look at where he went, he goes to the major cities at the time because he's trying to convert the most people possible. Okay? And then Paul fought openly with church leaders Peter and James. The book of Acts, and we'll see this is one of those areas where we have a contradiction. In the book of Acts, Paul gets along famously with James and Peter, but in Galatians, he doesn't. And how bad is it? James and Peter are saying Gentiles who convert to become Jesus believers. Paul says, I hope when they're circumcising you, they cut off their own penises.
Yeah.
And it's Galatians, it's been changed to, I hope that you emasculate yourself. I really would like to do a translation and say it, I mean, no one says emasculate yourself. But I mean, that's what he's saying about these guys. So we're gonna revisit all of this stuff, but right now and in this class, we're gonna talk about things that people had problems with Paul on over the years. And people have had problems with Paul from the very beginning. There have been 2 issues with Paul from the very beginning. And tell me if we're going too slow. And I need your help in figuring out which direction some of these classes will go. If if you say, I want to learn more about that, we can do that. But 2 things about Paul. One, that he was hard to understand. And in fact, in the Bible, in 2 Peter, it says, I want you reading Paul's letters, even though much of it's hard to understand. So the Bible acknowledges that Paul was hard to understand. And then the second one was people disliked him from the very beginning. And they disliked him throughout his life. And the letters are filled with people responding to people who dislike him. Book of 1 Corinthians and Galatians, that's almost all that it is responding to all these other people who have different ideas about what Christianity, eventually Christianity, what it should be. Go ahead.
Does the Bible anywhere speak about Paul's heritage or father? Obviously he was a Pharisee, so he probably came from a line of rabbis. But
He
recall
doesn't say much about himself. In Acts it says he was from Tarsus, but he never says where he came from. And you have to remember, again, these letters were not intended for us. They were letters to respond to specific problems, and eventually are compiled. And then they said, well, you should read these things. And like 2 Corinthians is not one letter. It's 4 or 5 letters that are put together as one. So we don't know very much about his background. He was Jewish. Tarsus is a large city. He was well educated, not like the most well educated, but he writes well. If you could read Greek, you'll see like the Gospel of Mark will have grammatical mistakes in it and stuff for the time. It's not terrible, but it's pretty good Greek. I mean, it's fair Greek. And then his stuff is good, and so you can tell that sort of stuff. But the people knew him that he was writing to, except for Romans. He was writing to people he knew. And so he didn't have to go back through, hey, this is Paul, you remember me? I grew up in Tarsus and my dad's name was Bob, and all of that sort of stuff. It was completely unnecessary. But here are some of the people over the years who have really disliked Paul. And much of this early on is people who read the Gospels and said Jesus is like this, and then they read the letters that Paul wrote, and they say they're not the same thing in those instances. Thomas Jefferson, not a fan of Paul. Loved Jesus. After he took out, in his Bible, he takes out all the miracles, and he keeps the teachings in, but he cut off Paul. He didn't want to use it. And he called him the first corrupter of doctrines of Jesus. You have the Russian novelist, Leo Tolstoy, who says he deviated from Jesus' teaching. Nietzsche, who obviously wasn't a Christian, didn't pretend to be, but he thought we should focus on life now and enjoy life as much as possible, sort of a hedonist, and talking about end times and denying yourself all this stuff, that's just crazy. It didn't make any sense to him. You know, he said that that Christians had a slavery mentality, that we were always trying to be least and all of these things, and he was like, no, we should try to be supermen and get what we can out of this life. The Ebionites, who I've talked about before, and I can talk to you guys about it again, it's the Jewish Christians, the followers of James. James and Paul end up going two different directions. And the followers of the Ebionites, they thought he had it all wrong on who Jesus was. They believed he was the Messiah, but they did not believe he was divine. And it's interesting that members of Jesus' family ends up joining this group. So they did not they put together their own canon of what's in the Bible, and it had Matthew, and it had a few other texts, but there was no Paul in any of it, because they thought he was, that he corrupted the message. And then finally, Bertrand Russell, another person who said that what he was putting together was intellectual rubbish. But as I said just a little ago, there's one scholar in particular who's been comparing first century Stoic philosophy and comparing it to Paul, and finds a lot of similarities, particularly in their notion of what the spirit is, pneuma. And that in Paul's writing, he generally talks about sin not as something you do individually, but as a cosmic force that affects all of us. And that idea is in some of the Stoic teachings and stuff. But again, we'll get back to this at some other point. And I want to talk about people who were opposed to him based on what he was teaching, not just that he was different from Paul. And this one is going to take a second for me to read. Has everybody ever heard of Howard Thurman? The civil rights leader, very influential in the civil rights movement. He wrote a book in 1949 called Jesus and the Disinherited. So just hang with me. I was going to give this out to you to look and read yourself, but I think I'm going to go through it. It'll be on a couple of slides. During much of my boyhood, I was cared for by my grandmother, who was born a slave and lived until the Civil War on a plantation near Madison, Florida. He was born in 1899. My regular chore was to do all of the reading for my grandmother. She could neither read nor write. 2 or 3 times a week, I read the Bible aloud to her. I was deeply impressed by the fact that she was most particular about the choice of scripture. For instance, I might read some of the more devotional Psalms, some of Isaiah, the Gospels again and again, but the Pauline epistles never, except at long intervals, the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. What's the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians? Yeah, which we all know because we've been to weddings. My curiosity knew no bounds, but we did not question her about anything. But that changes. When I was older and was halfway through college, I chanced to be spending a few days at home near the end of summer vacation. With a feeling of great temerity, I asked her one day why it was that she would not let me read any of the Pauline letters. What she told me I shall never forget. During the days of slavery, she said, the master's minister would occasionally hold services for the slaves. Old man McGee was so mean that he would not let a Negro minister preach to his slaves. Last page. Always the white minister used as his text something from Paul. At least 3 or 4 times a year he used as his text, slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters, as unto Christ. That's Ephesians 6:5. Then he would go on to show how it was God's will that we were slaves, and how if we were good and happy slaves, God would bless us. I promised my maker that if ever I learned to read, and if freedom ever came, I wouldn't read that part of the Bible. Pretty amazing thing. But we're going to get back around to this. You all know I grew up as a fundamentalist, and when I was in college, one of my majors was ancient Greek, and I started reading the Bible, and it caused this dissonance for me because I've been taught the Bible had no errors, the world's 6,000 years old, and for some reason I wasn't allowed to dance. But when I was reading the actual text, you start seeing that we don't have the originals of any of this stuff, and there's different translations that say different things. So that was jarring, but I also had a problem on one of these other issues. I'll go through some of the other problems that people have. We've talked about a couple of them. Paul is the homophobe. We just talked in the last class I did on Romans 1:26 and 27 and what he says there. One other thing that you should know about Paul that no one ever told me, but when I started reading academic work, everybody believes this, and that is that Paul believed that Jews and Gentiles were different, and that Gentiles, because they were polytheists, sin had overwhelmed them, and they engaged in vast amounts of sexual deviancy and immorality. And he thought Jews did not. And so he ends up writing a lot about sexual immorality because he thinks the Jewish communities he's writing to are consumed with it. And it turns out in 1 Corinthians, they are consumed with it. He describes some of the things that are going on, including one guy who's sleeping with his father's wife. And he's got to deal with that. And he discusses what you should do. But much of what he has to say about, in particular this section on Romans 1:26 and 27, is in that light. He's saying we all know what Gentiles are like. They're crazy and they do all these terrible things. They're not like us. We have a law and we follow the law. Other things, Paul the anti-Semite, and this has been a strong theme because of his view on the law and whether people had to follow the law or not. But again, we don't have anything in which we know what Paul told Jews about the law. We just know what he told Gentiles about the Jews and the law, okay? So that's something we can touch on more. Paul the prude. And this was when I was growing up in my church, and actually it's interesting, it was taught when my son was going through confirmation here. They would use verses from Paul saying you shouldn't be having sex before marriage. And then here, when Zach was, he's 30 now, when he was going through confirmation, you read this stuff, and then you got a sheet of paper that you had to sign and say, I won't do that. I won't have sex before I got married. And which was really, really interesting, is when we were going through the various commandments, the 10 commandments, and that was the one on adultery. To make it apply to the kids, we guilted them out and said, you better not do it. The only odd thing was we have a group, and it was 4 kids, and then the parents, we sat in a circle, we talked about the issue, and one of the kids said, hey, did all of you not have sex until you got and you could see, there was like a mild panic in the group, and now I know, it's a little over 90% of us do not abide by that rule in America. So, and it was funny, I talked to Pastor Chris about this, whether I thought it was okay, but they pull out verses from Paul to create this image of Paul as a prude. And then Paul the xenophobe, Paul the company man. You might remember under Trump, when they were putting children into cages and stuff, the Attorney General at the time was asked about it at a press conference. And do you remember what he said? He said, go read Romans 13:1. And Romans 13:1 said, you need to follow the government in whatever it does. And the interesting thing is Luther picked up on that because Romans was his favorite book. And so he believed any sort of rebellion was wrong. So he fought and opposed the Peasants' Revolt. And by extension, I assume he would not have supported the American Revolution. We're supposed to just support it. And so this thing about follow the government and so forth, it was used in that case. I haven't heard of any Trump supporters encouraging us to do that right now under the current president. But it was a very convenient thing at that time. But if you're interested, we can talk a little bit more about how we can, I think about the Bible as something that I used to think it was something we struggle with, and that's true too, but I think of it as something that we negotiate with, that we're trying to figure out what it means, and there's negotiations between the text and us and going back and forth. And if we want to talk about how we negotiate with a passage like that, just let me know. But the issue for me was misogyny. It really, 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 really bothered me. I mean, at that time, the homophobic stuff didn't bother me because I was in an evangelical school, and we all believed that there were no homosexuals on campus. And so that one didn't bother me so much, but the issue of women bothered me a great deal. And I kept on thinking, boy, it just did not seem fair to me. And women were not allowed to teach or to be pastors at the school where I was. And it didn't just make sense to me why this was the case. And I couldn't get it to make sense, even though I started reading everything. And I read Paul again and again. And I would run into something, verses like this. 1 Timothy 2:11-15. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. It's interesting, if you read 1 Corinthians 14, there's a very similar verse, but most people believe that's an interpolation, 2 verses that were inserted there, because the text reads just as well if you omit it. But in full submission, I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived, became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. So in this passage, which bothered me a lot, and I've read through it again and again, and I just, my understanding was there's no errors in the Bible. That God basically dictated this thing. How do we end up with this? And so I actually ended up asking some of my professors, and they said this is a matter of obedience. You need to obey what the text says and abandon the questions that you're asking. So that was like something that I couldn't do, and as a result, now I'm a Lutheran, and here I am. Here's from Ephesians. This passage, what is he doing? He's reasserting the patriarchy for inside the church and inside of public life. Women are to not lead in the church, and they're supposed to be home popping out babies. And the public realm is left for men, and they'll handle it, okay?
You're doing a great job.
The men are? And then here's another one in Ephesians that I ran into, and it is, wives, obey your husbands as you obey the Lord. The husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church, of the church people. The church is his body, and he saved it. Wives should obey their husbands in everything, just as the church people obey Christ. The reason it says church people in this translation is trying to say the church wasn't established yet. So other translations will say congregants, but we're mainly dealing with house churches. But this one is asserting the patriarchy that before it was in the church and in public life. Now it's in the home. Okay? So in these verses, what we've done is like put a circle around women in all of the contexts: private life, public life, and in the church. Okay? So I didn't know what to do with these things. And so I have an entire bookcase of feminist scholarship on stuff like this. And so I was stuck with the question of, does St. Paul hate women? Okay? And I could have just decided all of this stuff is bogus. Why should I pay attention to it? But this was meaningful for a reason, and people put this in here for a reason, and I wanted to understand that. But to answer this question, you have to do a little bit of understanding about how the Bible works. And the first question we have is, did Paul write everything attributed to him? Okay? What's the answer to this?
No.
So what is, and you're right, the answer is emphatic no. Does anyone have any ideas what books in the Bible, and I'm not saying these things shouldn't be in the Bible, should be in the Bible. I'm just saying we're trying to understand who Paul is, and that's what we're doing, is focusing on Paul, what Paul wrote. We don't want to take stuff that were people taking Paul's name and writing. We're trying to figure out what Paul's ideas were about women. And so, does anyone know which books were included? Go ahead.
1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans.
These are the books that are authentic?
Authentic, yeah.
And what were the other ones?
Galatians,
Okay. Yeah, very good, as a pastor should get this stuff. Former pastor. There's only one I disagree with you on, and that's 2 Thessalonians. There's a great deal of debate for 2 Thessalonians. The greatest thing about 2 Thessalonians, if you believe it wasn't written by Paul, there's a section in 2 Thessalonians 2 where he says, be watching out for forgeries. You gotta be really, really careful about having forgeries, and it'll say that Paul's name's on it. Don't believe those things, only trust me. So here's the list that's of authentic works, and this is in the order in which, on the authentic, it's the order in which it was written. 1 Thessalonians, which I told you about just a few minutes ago, had to do with where is Jesus and is he coming back. 1 and 2 Corinthians, I told you 2 Corinthians, it's interesting, there's more than one text. Philippians, a very hard and interesting book. Galatians is probably my favorite book that he wrote, not just because of the penis passage, but other things. Philemon, which is only one chapter, and it's a great passage, and if you want to discuss slavery, it's a passage that deals with, he has an escaped slave with him, and he's dealing with the issue of, do I send him back to his master? And that's the sort of stuff, that Howard Thurman's mother didn't want to hear that stuff. And Romans is his most complicated book, and it was because he was heading to Rome, he sent this letter ahead of time. Disputed, and this is, the first three are together as, there are some people, some scholars who believe that Paul could have written these. And then the last three, almost nobody believes Paul wrote those. And I'll tell you why. I thought about this, that I could get really, really deep in the weeds on this and talk about the number of conjunctions and all of this stuff, but I won't do that. This is how scholars figured this stuff out. The grammar and structure. For instance, they look at Ephesians and Colossians. Ephesians starts off chapter 1, and you get to verse 3, and it's all one sentence from verse 3 to verse 14. Okay? Huge. In Romans, by contrast, there are only, more than 25% of the verses in in Ephesians and Colossians are these huge sentences. Ephesians is one huge sentence after another, and that's just the way it is. Romans, by contrast, the largest text with 581 sentences in it, only has 3 of these. So the writing style is different. The language is different. Ephesians introduces 40 words that we've never had in anywhere else in the corpus of Paul's writing. So they're like, what's going on here with this stuff? Themes. The 1 and 2 Timothy in particular are very interested in who should be leading the church, including the text we just saw. Paul didn't care about that. He cared about the fact that Jesus is coming again. The church will probably not be around a year from now. I'm not worried who's a deacon and who's a minister, and whether whether you should be collecting money for this thing or that thing. He was focused on converting people. 1 and 2 Timothy, they want to establish a church. And it reminds me from my old collegiate days, grad school days, of Max Weber, the German sociologist, who said that religious movements start with a charismatic character, and usually an institution surrounds them, and the institution then becomes more and more conservative, undermining the message of the original charismatic person. And so in the themes, what you have is, something that seems very different from what Paul is writing. And then finally, there were early canons, and many of these early, and it wasn't until the year 363 that we had our first canon for the New Testament that tells us exactly what should be in there. And a guy named Marcion, though, wrote a canon, and he liked Paul, but he left out all of the 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. So but that's enough. I won't explain any more about this stuff. But that's how they come to these decisions. Is anyone interested in hearing more about this? I don't mind talking to you at some length. There's on Colossians, there's an 800-page book that goes through all of these different things. The only interesting response has been in a couple of the letters, Paul acknowledges that he has a secretary writing stuff. And so people, conservatives, have said maybe the conservative people reinterpreted him and wrote it in a completely different way than what he told them. But not many people bought that story. So when we have these undisputed letters, let's just set aside the disputed letters. What do they say about Jesus and women? Okay, so we'll just set this aside. What did Paul in these letters, what did he have to say? And this is what you'll find. You find there's no longer Jew or Greek, there's no longer slave or free, there's no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ. I mean, I don't know if you realize how radical this is. It's radical for us, but in Roman society, everything was a hierarchy. Nations were in a hierarchical setup. People were. So he's saying, in Christ, we're going to abandon the hierarchy, and these things disappear. It's a radical thing, so radical that Paul had problems with it. When he's talking to 1 Corinthians, in his 1 Corinthians letter, he repeats this, and it's either a poem or an early creed. Some of you might remember I taught a whole class on this passage. It's either a creed or a poem, and he's responding and saying it again, and he says it to the people in the early church, in 1 Corinthians, but he takes out, there is no longer male and female. He just says, there's no longer Jew or Greek, there's no longer slave or free. Because he thought the people in Corinthians, I'm guessing, would abuse that and start doing stuff that, in his eyes, they shouldn't be doing. So the thing is, I'm not trying to tell you that Paul was a progressive or a liberal in our sense. I'm just saying, when you focus on what he says, it's different than what people historically have said about him for a long time. In the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man. This is in 1 Corinthians. Nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman, but everything comes from God. So I was dealing with this issue of what Ephesians says, and then you get this complementary thing about marriage, which is very different from that. Women, obey your husbands as you obey Christ. Read this up against this. It's not saying, he did not believe that women and men were exactly alike and so forth, but this is a pretty radical thing, again, in a society full of the patriarchal hierarchy, that he's turning on its side and leveling the field. And then there's this one, 1 Thessalonians 2:7. He talks about and gives a metaphor for the work he's been doing. We were gentle among you, like a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. So those are interesting things. And if we start our conversation about Paul with these 3 verses and many other verses in which he talks about women, it would change. And so it was making so I was no longer in like a panic about Paul and whether, I had to eventually leave the church or anything like that. It was like, Paul is not perfect, but he's telling us all of this interesting stuff. But in addition to do what I say, there's this matter of do what I do. And that is, when you look through the New Testament, he's surrounded by women. His co-workers, again and again and again, are women. And I'm just going to take, in 1 Corinthians, he says he's responding to a situation in 1 Corinthians because the minister at a house church, Chloe, said, we've got some problems. So we've got a minister at a house church who was a female around the year 55 AD. Here, he's writing a letter in Romans 16, and he praises 10 different women, saying, she's doing this, she's doing that. When you see this person, be aware of that. He mentions Phoebe, a minister and financial supporter who delivered the letter. He gave it to Phoebe. She went to Rome and dropped off the letter. Okay? It's also interesting that she's a financial supporter of his ministry and other ministries. Does this remind you of anything? That is Luke 8. Jesus thanks 3 women for financially supporting his ministry. We all know about the disciples, but and Mary Magdalene's among those 3. She had some sort of resource. So in both cases, it's the women who are financially supporting Jesus' ministry and Paul's ministry. Then there's Priscilla and Aquila, which are mentioned, they're mentioned in Acts, they're mentioned in other letters, and then they're mentioned here. It's a wife and husband team who were co-workers with him from the beginning of his ministry up until then. And then Junia, and I've taught 2 classes here, it's been a while, but Junia is the only apostle mentioned in the Bible. He says, Paul says that she was a Jewish person. She came to understand and have faith in Jesus before he did, and that she's outstanding among the apostles. But up until like 50 years ago, male translators of Romans 16 didn't like this because there were no female apostles. So they said the text must be wrong, and they added an S to the text and made it Junius, which is a guy. And you'll find some Bibles today that still say Junius. And so it makes you much more comfortable if you are a conservative Christian and you believe only the apostles were only men. And it's only turned out recently that people start saying, first of all, we know no Juniuses who were around back in Roman times. And then secondly, this isn't in any of the early texts. It's Junia. So, so these are the people he surrounded himself, and he's telling a message. So the question is, how did we end up with the Paul that was bothering me so much? And this is the new misogynistic Paul. Paul dies, okay? He's written these 7 letters that we mentioned, and Acts hasn't been written yet, and some of this other stuff happens, and they're wondering what they should do without Paul around. Jesus doesn't return. So when Jesus doesn't return, we gotta get used to daily life, and we gotta figure out what to do. Jewish and Christian communities begin to part after the Jewish rule. I know this is something we weren't taught a lot about, but the Jewish rule is like an early version of the Holocaust. Hundreds of thousands of Jews are killed. They revolt and try to take Jerusalem back for themselves, and the Romans march down, and between the years 66 and 74, they just wipe it out. In fact, one writer about the situation said they were crucifying so many people they ran out of wood in Jerusalem. And Josephus says that he went with the soon-to-be emperor walking through town and noticed 3 of his friends hanging on crosses who weren't dead yet. And he convinced the emperor to take 2 of them off the crosses, and one of them lived 30 years after that. But they were all over the place. You can't read Josephus. It's some terrible stuff that went on. And you know, if you've ever heard of Masada, that's the end of the revolt. There's a small group of these people who escape, go to Masada, and in the year 74, the remaining forces of the Romans build a wall at the bottom and then slowly march up, and they end up committing suicide. So this is going on, and the Christians don't want to be associated with the Jews because the Jewish people had just done this. So they started saying, hey, maybe we're not associated with the Jews at all. The author of Ephesians is writing a household code, and there's the German if you want to know it, that affirms and reinstates the patriarchy at home. Paul is dead. Ephesians, I believe, is written in a generation after Paul, and so they're trying to deal with the situation there. It doesn't work in their society, in Roman society, to have a level playing field between men and women. It just would be a very radical thing. And so in Ephesians, we see it drop back up. And in 1 Timothy, we see that they want to establish in the church that men are in charge and women are not, and they want to make sure that women aren't involved with public life. So that's where we end up going with Paul. And so from the time, and 1 Timothy is written 2 generations after Paul. Probably Paul dies around 60, First Timothy is probably written around 120 or so, 110 or 120. So you see this movement that you have Jesus and then Paul, two very dynamic people, but as soon as they disappear, the people start writing texts in their memory to justify patriarchy within the church, public life, and at home. So I was getting caught up on that stuff. And it's interesting with Howard Thurman's thing, he was getting caught up on another pseudo-Paul book. His mother was. Ephesians 6:5 was probably not written by Paul. So again, the interesting thing is now you have to deal with these things. They are in the Bible and they're difficult passages, but if we want to understand who Paul is not this misogynist, okay? But after Paul's death and after a generation or two, not everybody went this way. There were groups that had, there were many Christianities at the time, and we didn't know what was Orthodox and what wasn't. But there was a community that believed that they took Paul's words about not getting married and all that stuff, who taught that Paul was taught celibacy. And there's this whole Acts, it's just like the Acts of the Apostles. It's called the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Has anyone ever heard of this? So she's getting ready to get married. Thecla is. She's sitting in her house with her window open, and Paul is next door. So she, for 3 days, gets to hear what he's saying. And he's saying we should be focused on heaven, not having sex, not getting married and stuff. So she abandons her husband and her mother, and I mean not husband, her fiance. So they spend a lot of time trying to get her, and Paul ends up getting dragged somewhere else, and Thecla starts her own ministry. And she teaches about Jesus, she teaches about Paul, and then she also teaches people they should not be having sex. And this goes on. She gets thrown before the lions, and she survives. She realizes a couple years later she's never baptized, and there's this big vat. She thought it was empty. She jumps in, and it's got killer seals. I have no idea what a killer seal is. But there were killer seals in there, and they don't eat her. And she goes on, and she ends up fleeing and moving and going into a cave to escape persecution. And that's where the story ends. It's an interesting story. In the Orthodox Church, she's a saint, and they celebrate her life. In the Catholic Church, she was a saint until about 40 years ago when they dropped her as a saint. And in the Protestant Church, we have no idea who she is. Here's a sixth century picture of the two of them. The one other interesting thing about it is it's also the only source of our information that tells us what Paul looked like. And he, Onesiphorus, saw Paul coming towards Iconium, a man rather small in size, bald-headed, bandy-legged, well-built, with eyebrows meeting, rather long nose, full of grace. I'm not sure I would believe this guy. So that's the end of my presentation. Does anyone have any questions about this stuff? Did most of you understand that there are disputed and not disputed? Some break it up into three categories, which is undisputed, and then like the maybe category, and that would include Ephesians, Colossians, and 1 Thessalonians, and then definitely not, which would be the pastoral epistles. But the thing is you still have to deal with the issue that they're in the Bible, and most of us just ignore this stuff because it doesn't bother us or affect us in any sort of way. But for me, when you're taught that everything in the Bible is true, you have to learn how to deal with these things. You're first.
I was just wondering, Timothy is a personal letter.
It is, and that's actually, it's different because everywhere else he's writing messages concerning.
I think that would be from him. I don't know. But how did they come up with the years when it was written? I was wondering.
It would some of it's due to the themes, because as I said, in Timothy and Titus, they're extremely interested in the structure of the church. And when Paul becomes when he's converted, or whatever you want to call it, or in around 35, there is no church. There's nothing. And his ministry is on converting people. And he sets up house churches around the place. But he wasn't interested at all and who the bishop was going to be. But First and Second Timothy are extremely interested in those things. Plus, the language in First and Second Timothy is unlike anything that Paul wrote. But you have these themes that are in there too, and that's why I didn't want to run into that. But man, scholars spend an enormous amount of time studying the length of the sentences, the language that's used in Paul. In one case, there's a book that's on how often he used the generative, which is a particular structure of a word within each of the 13 letters, and he goes through and does. I mean, as a master, as a doctoral dissertation. Go ahead.
2 questions. One, I've been under the impression that the movement of Paul's expansion of Christianity had a lot to do also with the first destruction of the temple, the diaspora that took place in the 400s. There were Jews all over the empire when Paul went out, and he started many of his communities in the synagogues.
This is the difference between Acts and Paul's own writings. Paul's writings, he's a missionary to the Gentiles, and he does not, in general, engage with.
That's interesting.
But in Acts, he starts in each community that he goes to the synagogues where he meets Jews and God-fearers.
Right.
God-fearers is a category of Gentiles who went to the synagogues, listened to the story, and it would abide by the law as much as they could. And so those were, Acts says that this is, this is the way he did it. I focus mainly on what he wrote and what he has to say. But it's true. And there's a book coming out now saying that among scholars, Acts has been left off and not paid attention to. But there are incredibly interesting stories in it. But most of the major Pauline biographies don't even mention Tarsus because it's in Acts, not in any of his letters. They don't mention all of those things. But maybe that is what he did. But in the end, he becomes the apostle to the Gentiles.
And the second question,
Yeah.
in more recent research, where Paul prays 3 times, he's got this thorn in the flesh. I hear so much of the radio preachers who kind of want to tell us what that is, that he was gay or that he was epileptic. Has there been any new research? He prays 3 times that it'll be removed and it never is.
Yeah, I don't think anybody has any interest. One thing that is interesting and people are writing about is the idea of Paul as a mystic. We don't really think of it that way, but he has a vision which nobody with him saw, and then he ends up going to the 3rd heaven where he's ended up being taught by Jesus a number of different things.
The rapture stuff picks up on that.
And so he, so these messages are things that nobody else heard, which gives him a sense of power. Because if someone would question, oh, are you sure that's what you believe? Well, actually, I was talking to Jesus last night, and that's what he said. So, it's almost like a trump card for him in case, you're trying to figure out what to, if you disagree with him. And clearly, James and Peter, and you guys know I taught a class on James last year, and I'm very interested in this split between the two of them. Between James, who believed that to be a follower of Jesus, you had to be circumcised, and you had to keep kosher, and you had to follow all the rules for the Jews. And Paul believed that was not true at all. They didn't need to be circumcised. They didn't need to keep kosher. They didn't need to do any of these things. And in his letter to the Galatians, James has sent people there, and Peter has actually come himself there and done stuff while Paul was not there, and he ends up with much of the letter ripping on Peter, saying you shouldn't have done these things.
But then Peter has the vision of the sheet coming down from heaven, which is a transformation. But
that one's that's an interesting passage since in Mark, while Peter is around with Jesus declares all food clean. So in Mark, Peter is told all foods are clean, but in Acts he doesn't know that.
right.
And he has to have a vision telling him that all food is clean. Maybe he's a slow learner.
Well, but it's a bit like what you were saying earlier about how the Bible is a negotiation between God's faithful people and God, and just like we learned today in service, the wrestling, this Jewish idea of midrash, that we have to wrestle with the Bible in order
Right.
for it to reveal its truths to us.
I love Midrash.
I do too, and I just recently finished Bono's autobiography, Surrender, and he talks about his encountering with Paul through Scripture, that there's a transformation in the character of Paul throughout Scripture, going from this zealot who's relentless and a man of violence in pursuit of his sense of the will of God, to being an old man who was a man of peace and wisdom and tranquility, which I haven't read these scriptures in a chronological order. I have not encountered that same progression in Paul's life, but it's interesting to me that he has. But about the synagogues, Paul was usually put out of the synagogue then in the book of Acts, that
Right.
there's some rioting going on, and then he's starting these house churches. So both what's in his letters and what's in the book of Acts can still be reconciled in that respect.
Yeah. When I talked about negotiating stuff, we've already done this, but you may not realize it. Throughout the Old and the New Testaments, women are property, okay? And that's what everything in there. But we've negotiated it and figured out that we don't believe that, okay? So we've worked that through, and we need to figure that out. And some of it comes from the idea, which is very important to us as Lutherans, that we need to major on the major issues. And that is, Jesus told us what we should be doing, what the principal commandments are. We know what the story is, and we can take an issue like slavery. The majority of texts in the Bible about slavery says slaves obey your masters. And so during the Civil War, unfortunately, that was a very public negotiation of what we do. And it's happened more recently with gay marriage. A number of people believe that the Bible condemns that sort of thing, but we've, on our own, for whatever reason, and I think a lot of it's come from many of us meeting and getting to know someone who's gay, experience. The interesting thing, I was reading a thing 2 weeks ago about the experience of zealots and how you change their minds on a number of issues, and facts are not the way. Mm-hmm. It's experience. And so if that person encounters something that they didn't expect, and that's happened throughout our society. So we've gone from, in the last 25 years, to a society, for us, only 40% of people opposed the ban on same-sex marriage in Wisconsin in 2005 or 2004. And now, according to the Marquette poll, more than 60% of us think it's fine. And then when we look at the Bible and we encounter verses like in Leviticus and stuff, the thing you need to do is say, Jesus gives us these two major commandments, or you've got Matthew 25, who says, how do we know we're a follower of God? Because I've helped the poor, I've helped the inmates, I've done all of these things. And the person says, well, Jesus, I've never met you. And he says, but you have, because I am those people that you're helping out. So it took me a long time to figure out that I have to negotiate these passages, which I don't think is a bad thing. Some people will criticize the fact that you have, like a salad bar, you go through and pick whatever you want out of the Bible, but you can't deny what the majority of messages is, and the importance of grace, the importance of justice, and the importance of love. And when I talked about Paul earlier, about setting up Paul on one side and Jesus on another, there are certain things where they both agree, and you can't deny that, and that is the importance of love. That's at the center of both of their messages. Another thing that's important is the kingdom of God and how we should act. And when I read the stories, and this took me a long while to figure out, but when I read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus is doing, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when he's doing healings and stuff, and he's helping the poor, what he's doing is enacting the kingdom of God. He's not doing, these aren't parlor tricks, because there were other people around doing that sort of stuff. What he's saying is, exorcism. In the kingdom of God, there aren't going to be people with demons in them. There aren't going to be people with these problems, with these physical ailments and stuff. this is what it's going to be like. So he's enacting the kingdom of God. And when we read that, what does that mean? It means we should be enacting the kingdom of God. It's incumbent upon us to do that sort of thing.
Can you just comment, Dan, on just wasn't Martin Luther kind of his transformation through reading Paul?
It was, you probably heard the story about how he was terrified because of a lightning storm, which sounds silly, but he was not terrified because he's afraid of lightning. He was terrified that he had not confessed all of his sins, and that he would die with sins that weren't confessed. And so when he was going through that and thinking through that, he started reading the Bible and started realizing that that's not the heart of Christianity. That's not going and confessing and keeping track of all your sins and that sort of stuff. But Romans, and this is an important thing, and we'll talk about this. There's two new schools of thought about Paul. One's called the new perspective on Paul, and the other one's called the radical perspective on Paul. And there've been strong critiques of what Luther did, but Luther's thing was to take and read the Bible and convince us that everybody could read the Bible and that we could understand these things. But his message focused completely on Romans is about justification by faith, but the critique is that Luther was unfair in his understanding of what Jews were. He made Jews and bad Catholics together in the same, and so his message ends up getting used by people later on for anti-Semitic purposes. And so, like Kristallnacht, I don't know if you realize this, occurred on the feast of St. Martin. It was celebrated on Martin Luther's birthday because he gets tied in. But this is something that it's like really important for me to let you guys know this is what people think about Luther today, and how he interpreted these passages. But it wasn't, what he did was incredibly freeing, because you're not spending all your time trying to figure out what you did wrong and how you need to confess those things. That grace is at the center of the message, not a bunch of rules.
Could you comment on Paul as a mystic and the development of his theology in Arabia?
I don't know anything about his theology. He went to Arabia according to, he ends up going early on to Arabia. We don't know what what ideas. He just says that he went there, was there for a number of years, and then after he did that, then he goes to Jerusalem. Because it used to be thought that he got all this message from Peter and James, the two people who led the Jerusalem church. But I think you're right, it occurred out there, out in Arabia, which wasn't too far away from where the community did the Dead Sea Scrolls were involved. And we don't know, I believe John the Baptist had contacts with the people with the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we don't know. All we know is he became a mystic, and that the foundation of his story comes from his own personal communications with Jesus. Any other questions?
I was wondering if you could just clarify who decided what was going to be in the Bible. Was it a compilation over many years? Because I wondered how, if Paul died in 60 AD and yet they included books that he apparently didn't write, did they put those in later, or was there no Bible when he was there? I don't know that history.
The first time that we had the 27 books of the New Testament, someone said, these are our 27 books that we should have, was in a letter by a guy named Athanasius, a bishop. He writes a letter in 360, I said 363 earlier, 365, I need to get my numbers straight. In 365, he sends a note to all of the preachers in his district and says, you can only preach from these texts. You know that there are dozens and perhaps hundreds of other texts that were floating around. And the church then agrees to those 27 and then starts punishing people who use those other texts. The first 364 years were engaged in a huge fight among Christians to figure out what belonged in the Bible and what didn't belong in the Bible. And there were people putting together lists saying, I think we should have sacred scriptures just like the Jews, and I think we should have these things. And the Ebionites, they chose Matthew as their gospel, because Matthew writes a whole lot about Moses, the Ten Commandments and all that sort of stuff. Marcion, who believed there were two gods, the evil God of the Old Testament and the good God of the New Testament, ends up taking Luke. The Gnostics end up agreeing on John. So people were negotiating these things, disagreeing with things, and it's interesting. There are books that really, really came close to ending up in our Bible. The Shepherd of Hermas. Has anyone ever heard of that? It's a text that appears in all the early, the largest complete text that we have. Codex Vaticanus has the Shepherd of Hermas, and that's in the 4th century. So even up to that time of 365, but it didn't stop at that point, the negotiation, because Luther didn't like certain texts in the Bible. Just like Paul, Peter didn't like James, and so he wanted James kicked out of the thing, and he really hated Revelation and wanted Revelation to be removed from the Bible. It didn't happen, but there was a debate, and he was pushing this sort of thing. So, any other questions? Good questions. So I'm going to talk in like a couple of minutes about the trip that we're taking. If you're interested in it, just hang around. That doesn't mean you're going to do it or anything, but if you're interested in the information, then hang around for like 10 minutes.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks.